and welcome to News Desk. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Amin Isif.
Job cuts, funding cuts, pulling out of international bodies and agreements. Is this a war on science?
I'm immediately withdrawing from the unfair, one-sided Paris Climate Accord ripoff.
You know, what's going on in Washington right now is an abomination because science is being destroyed by the current administration.
In a few moments, I will sign an executive order to begin eliminating the Federal Department of Education once and for all.
The Trump administration is waging a war on college and a war on knowledge.
Why do autocrats fear higher education?
So, how is President Trump's administration targeting scientific learning in the US? That's what we're looking at on this week's News Desk.
And we've already had a lot of comments in our community post on YouTube. I've gone through it, and there's a lot of great stuff here. Somebody named Penzor says, science is not an island. Nobody has money anymore, and we can't afford to fund science on premises of breakthroughs. We also have a comment from Paul Murphy who says, science wins wars, not stupidity. So pointing out the national advantage of investing in research. And then here's one that I found really interesting. This is from C.H. Michael. The thing about facts is that they are not negotiable. It's theories and models that are open to scrutiny. Sadly, some of the supposed facts we were told lately turned out not to be as advertised. That opens the door to mistrust. But facts will prevail. So optimistic take here, but pointing out that a lot of people who are doubting science right now are basing it on the fact that they feel like they've been lied to in recent years. And one last one that's really going to open up the conversation, I want to get to this during this episode, is this one's from GFD. He says, or she says, the brain drain has been in the EU. So pointing out a fact that we've been dealing with for a long time, for decades now, that a lot of EU scientists have long been going to the US as a place to do their research. But we're going to be talking about how that might be reversing.
Yeah,
now.
Definitely. And we've got somebody very good who will be talking about that a little bit later. But before we talk about our guests, let's just introduce you to who else we have around the table. We have Dustin Hemmerlein, who is our sort of reporter today. He will be doing some research for us, also giving us a little bit of a timeline about what's happened since the Trump administration.
What do you mean, sort of reporter? Like, I feel like
a proper,
fully
very
credentialed
senior
reporter.
Fully credentialed reporter, exactly.
But you were giving us in a moment. I'm not undermined. I feel like I need to give you an editorial editor type title. But you will be giving us a bit of a timeline.
I'm good with the reporter title, thanks.
You'll be giving us a timeline on what's been happening since the 20th of January. So we look forward to that. Thanks for being here.
And we also have Jared Reed, who's going to be in the chat with you guys today.
In the chat.
He's going to be in the chat. He's going to be finding some comments that we're going to then feed to us and to our experts. And I'm going to be doing that as well, but he's going to be the main guy. So if you do have questions directly for us and you haven't been heard and you really want to be heard, address him. He's going to be addressing that. And we also have, later in our show, we have Zulfikar Abani. He is DW's own science reporter, and he's also a senior editor at the science department. So we're going to be talking to him about the facts and figures.
And we'll also be talking to Christina Pargell, who is Professor of Operational Research at University College London. You may be wondering, what does that title mean? We will be asking her that very question. I can tell you, though, that she has got a PhD in space physics, so she's obviously very clever, and she also has been writing a lot about Trump and his administration and how she feels that they are playing into the authoritarian playbook when it comes to targeting, for example, science and research. So do please send us your questions that we can put directly to her. That would be great. And to get us into the mood, we have a poll, of course. Jared, you've been working very hard on that.
Very hard, Alex. Very, very hard. Yeah, so we have a poll for you today. The question is Donald Trump undermining US scientific dominance? We have 4 options for you to choose from. So yes, research will suffer. No, there's no real alternative to the US. We heard about the brain drain from the EU to the US just now. No, phony science must be purged. And maybe, but it's still too early to tell. So those are your 4 options. Please do vote, and we will tell you how people voted at the end of the stream.
Be interesting to see how those results come in. OK, over to our reporter, Dustin, now. Dustin, before we take a proper deep dive into all this, give us a bit of a timeline of what has happened and why people, particularly in the scientific community, are concerned at the moment.
Yeah, basically, this takes us back to a day that might seem far away now, but it's not very far away, when Trump took office. On his first day, we all remember him signing lots of executive orders. I actually have a photo of that up on my screen if you guys want to show that. And, you know, we all know this picture where he, like, sits on his desk, or, like, I know on the first day he was also, for some of them, in the stadium. And 2 of these orders are where it all started, right? Like, one of them lets the US exit the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is tracking diseases all over the world, and also invests a lot in research. So very important organization. And, of course, with health comes a lot of science, a lot of research. And the other thing is he writes another executive order that makes the US exit the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is, of course, a big climate change agreement that, kind of lays out the goals for all nations of the world to reduce emissions. And he kind of exited both of these, like, very fundamental agreements. Of course, climate change also has a lot to do with science. And then
with Paris, he'd pulled out of that, hadn't he, in his first term?
Yes, he did pull out in his first term. Biden re-entered. Big difference is that the pulling out last time, it took almost the entirety of his first term, right? Like, and now it was very immediate. Like, right away, the US left the Paris Agreement and, like, stopped, like, I don't know, caring about its own emissions. And some of his policies are even directed to more emissions, or will probably cause more emissions. Then, of course, his presidency went on. And as we all know, everyone who reads the news knows, a part of his presidency are a lot of job cuts or funding cuts to many US government departments. Some of those are NASA, also the space program, and then the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, which he had, like, lots of tensions with in his first term when COVID happened, right? And a lot of these cuts also affect people who were kind of working in science for the government, like researching for the government, or organizing funds that then the government would give out to scientists. And then it all kind of reaches a tipping point when he appoints Robert F. Kennedy as the boss of many federal scientists. Robert F. Kennedy is now the boss of the of all American healthcare institutions, and he, of course, in his past, did call into question the effectiveness of vaccines. He now says he's not an anti-vaxxer, but in his past he did propose some theories that kind of sounded like it. So that also makes a lot of scientists very nervous.
And I would say, too, I mean, during the campaign, the reason why RFK Jr. got a lot of attention was specifically because he posited himself as the opposite of this, like, strain of scientists who were promoting lockdowns and wearing masks and vaccines, and he built a name for himself around that. And that's exactly why Trump hired him, because he wanted to reach the people who felt like the refrain "follow the science" was bunk, and they didn't like it. So it really was, in a lot of ways, it was a stance. I don't think they would say it was against science, but a stance against established science anyway.
Yeah, and, like, right, that's a big part of it is like focus on medicine and on Medicare, right? Like, where a lot of that is at least perceived for many as, like, a very big part of science, right? Like, in a part that affects a lot of people, and a lot of money goes into that research, into cancer research and other programs like it. And then we come to the last big point I want to make, and the most recent one. The Trump administration has also defunded or threatened the funding of many American universities, right? Most prominent and most recently Columbia University, where like $400 million were, in question. Like they lost that money now, and then they still entered an agreement with the Trump administration to change many of their policies. And then this also affects many smaller universities in the US as well. It's not only those like couple of big ones. Actually, I want to play a little soundbite from one professor. Sorry, let me look at my notes. Mia McIver. She's the executive director of the American Association of University Professors, and she kind of explains what this means to many professors. Let's have a listen.
Let me put this as plainly as possible. Trump's cuts kill. By canceling $400 million in federal funding at Columbia and billions nationwide, Trump is targeting life-saving medical research that helps ordinary Americans stay healthy. These grants fund research in cancer, Alzheimer's, stroke, diabetes, and more. By preventing the development of therapies and cures, Trump's cuts will kill the critically ill patients who depend on cutting-edge biomedical research to save their lives.
Yeah, so very, very strong reaction there. But what has the Trump administration, what justifications have they used for this?
Yeah, good question, Alex. I can actually show you on my screen the main justification. It's a website many of you probably know. It's the big website from the Department of Government Efficiency, right? It is to cut costs. So when I show you this website, I want to say a lot of this information might not be super accurate. There's been lots of criticism of the data that goes into this, but it is what the Trump administration says the reason, right? Like they are cutting a lot of money. If we scroll down, like it has this agency efficiency leaderboard is what they call it. And the two top points are the Department of Education on position 2 and the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. And Health and Human Services means a lot of like the CDC, for example, a big important organization in the American medical system is part of that. So these two are like majorly affected by all the cuts that he is or his government is making. And yeah, and the big goal, I guess, is the number on top, all the savings he's presenting to the American people as the advantage of his presidency, right?
Thank you very much, Dustin. I guess another big issue will be his so-called war on woke, which we'll hopefully pick up on a little bit later with our guests. Do you have some comments?
Yeah, people are just already sharing their opinions about what they think about what Trump is doing. We do have some people supporting it. Apple Juice says they give too many people thinker privileges. We now need workers. So trying to make a distinction between people they think deserve the money and people they don't deserve the money. I can imagine that Apple Juice doesn't think that all scientists are just getting thinking privileges, that they're doing stuff that really helps. I mean, Elon Musk himself considers himself a scientist, and he has a lot of the backing of Trump's MAGA movement. But then you have the humanities, which a lot of people don't consider science, and that's definitely a dividing line in the U.S. And then Jonathan Guerrero says, you would think Germany and other European countries would try to recruit scientists and experts from the U.S. That's definitely something we're going to be talking about.
Indeed.
And Carolina Vilena, always in our chat, thanks for your comments. She said that the pandemic was a time that we learned a lot about science, but we have to then have a debate about what we learned, because I think a lot of people learned one thing and the other half of the people learned another thing, and that still hasn't been decided yet.
Good point. OK, well, let's welcome now our first guest onto News Desk. Zulfikar Abami is DW Senior Science Editor, and it's great to have you on, Zulfikar. Thank you very much for joining us. Joining us from Bonn, actually, which is the other side of where we are in Germany. Also used to be the capital city for anybody who doesn't know much about Germany, but of course Berlin is now. We've just had Dustin there giving us a sort of a bit of a timeline about some of the things that have happened with regards to science and academia since January, since Trump took office. I have a question, first of all. Do you think it is fair to say that the US government is actually targeting scientific work and science and research?
Well, it is fair to say that because that's effectively what's happening. A lot of the policies that have been put in place, the executive orders, have all had a very direct effect on academic institutions, etc. And it has been called an assault on science, a war on science by people in the US. I mean, I would feel like, or I do feel like it's more of a war of rhetoric and a war of ideologies, if I am to be fair. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the health secretary, has said, for instance, when it comes to things like measles and vaccinations, he said a lot of people who take an ideological approach to health are going to be unhappy. We're going to tell the truth. So there is that. But it's very difficult to tell. And it's very difficult to gauge how much of an effect we're going to have because things are still developing at this point. Yeah.
And we'll pick up on Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in a moment, but just sticking with that issue of health, and also Dustin was talking about it with Trump leaving the World Health Organization. It does seem that public health in particular has certainly been a main focus of the administration so far. Can you just give us an idea if there has now, just a few weeks later, been an actual impact on public health in the United States, even globally?
Well, in the United States, of course, I mean, we've seen an outbreak of measles, and they are trying to sort of change their position day by day on how to deal with this. So, we're seeing it spread. We're seeing measles spread internationally as well. And so how they direct their attentions and how they direct their advice, the administration directs advice, is obviously having a direct impact. I can unpack that a little bit later. But I think, one of the sort of most striking things that we're seeing is, like, for instance, I know you've done a previous program about US aid, but we have seen there a direct impact. So there is an academic in Boston University, who is tracking this and has basically found out, or is tracking, about 103 deaths per day, I think it is. I might have to check that just one second. Essentially, but quite a lot of deaths per day. Let me just check that. I've just lost that out of my head there. But anyway, I'll come back to it. Here you go. 103. No, in fact, worse than that. 103 deaths per hour is the impact of what's happened already. We're already seeing also an impact in Ethiopia, for instance, because US aid is being cut. And a lot of the money there was going to, for instance, HIV measures. And through the war in Tigray, we've seen that the number of infections, the prevalence of HIV is now more than double of what it was before the war started. And at the very least, we can say that with these cuts, the US is not going to be present there in order to help in this situation. I mean, those are just some direct cuts. And of course, so, Columbia University and other institutions, they've seen many people go, as you've already pointed out. A lot of vital research into cancer and to Alzheimer's is just not going to get done now because people are scared. I mean, there is what one of my colleagues, in fact, all of my colleagues have said, there's a chilling effect. And the point here is that, the last time we heard about the chilling effect was when the NSA revelations came out, Edward Snowden, where people didn't want to talk, and you could see how the effects were totally networked. And that's what we're seeing here as well, because, and you've also mentioned, and I will, this is my last sentence here, you've mentioned how European institutions and in other countries as well are saying, oh, well, we could welcome researchers over. The problem with science is, though, it's completely networked, just like surveillance is completely networked. And so it's not just a simple case of saying, oh, give us your wretched and we'll look after them. You can't do that because it's going to affect science globally and public health globally.
Yeah. And just picking up, I mean, you've said a lot, but did you have something you wanted to jump in? Because I just wanted to ask quickly. I didn't know if you did.
You were leaning forward.
Are you also leaning forward?
One quick thing. I just wanted to say, I think I found the link that Zulfikar was talking about, the tracker. I think we can share that in the chat in just a minute. I'll send it to Jared and he can post that link in the chat. I hope that's the right one.
Deaths per hour, 103 deaths.
Brooke Nichols, I think it says.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much for finding it.
Yes.
So there we have it. But just picking up then, I mean, we talked a lot there. You talked globally. You also then talked about, for example, Columbia University and the research the decisions to cut funding have hit medical research there. We talked about Robert F. Kennedy, and we talked about measles and the outbreak there, and how that's being dealt with. Just given the fact that he was chosen to be the health secretary as the focal point for the science community now and for the public, what message does that send, do you think?
That's a very good question. I think it sends it depends on which side of the fence you're on. It might send the correct message. I can only look at it from a very scientific and a very sort of database perspective. If we take measles, for instance, the message on measles vaccination has been a little bit shaky, let's say. And you'd expect from a government to have a very firm line. This is the best thing for you to do. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has said, yeah, well, we're not going to stop anybody getting the vaccine, or we're not going to reduce access, but you should know that it's everybody's choice, and you could just take cod liver oil and vitamin A and vitamin D and steroids as well that you can use. But putting those sorts of measures in the same context, in the same sentence as a vaccine, really is like comparing the proverbial apples and pears. A vaccine is there to prevent an infection. It does not necessarily kill a virus. It can prevent your being infected. And if you do get infected, a virus will then maybe the course of your infection might not be as severe. If you take cod liver oil or whatever else you want to take, antibiotics have in the past been used to help people who are suffering with measles. That's not going to affect the virus. That's going to stop you getting other infections, such as earaches or whatever else you might get that may weaken your immune system. And on the basis of the vaccine, so the first vaccine was introduced in the 60s. Before that, we had about 30 million cases per year of measles, 2 million deaths per year from measles. Right now, the latest data from the WHO says that worldwide, the latest data is from 2022, 200,000 cases. So we've gone from 30 million to 200,000 cases. So you can talk about, correlations and causations, but you can definitely see that far fewer people are getting infected with measles. But if you look to the outbreak in the US, I forget the complete number, it's definitely 70% of people are unvaccinated. The 6-year-old child who died in February, unvaccinated. And most of the other people, children, adolescents, and sort of 20s and up, unvaccinated. They're the people getting infected. So you can draw your own conclusions, whether that's an ideological stance or a scientific stance, but I'm just reading the numbers, and it looks fairly convincing to me.
Yeah, OK, good point. Thank you very much for sharing that. We have got our next guest who will be joining us shortly, but just before she does, I'd just like to make sure that we actually hear from Donald Trump himself as we are discussing this, and it's obviously under his watch. We've talked about anti-science America, but it's very clear that he's not anti-science, is he? I mean, he's very pro-technology, AI, space. Let's just talk about him in a moment, but first of all, let's just hear what he's got to say.
We are going to conquer the vast frontiers of science, and we're going to lead humanity into space and plant the American flag on the planet Mars and even far beyond.
OK, so that was Donald Trump there talking about conquering vast frontiers of science, including Mars. Just before we talk about that, let's bring in our next guest because she is with us. It's Professor Christina Pargel, who is a Professor of Operational Research at University College London. Very great to have you with us. And I will ask you in a moment exactly what your title means, because we need to hear that. But we've just heard there from Donald Trump. They're talking about conquering the vast frontiers of science and you know, leading humanity into space and planting the American flag on the planet Mars. So we can't say that he is anti-science, can we? Let me put that to you, Professor Pargel.
Well, I think we can. I think he has a fundamental misunderstanding of what science is. You don't just get to pick and choose the bits that you like. And I think, you know, his desire to conquer space is about his desire for celebrity and attention, and it's coming directly from Elon Musk. I don't think he has any idea of the science involved in landing a spaceship or people safely on Mars or the engineering it is. And you can see that they're planning 50% of cuts to NASA's science budget. So I remain unconvinced by his commitment to space science.
Why don't you get to pick and choose what you want in science? Maybe you could elaborate on that.
Why? Well, because you don't know where science is going to lead. You don't know which bits of science will be useful for other bits in the future. So if you think about, you know, the purest of mathematics, you know, things that are like kind of esoteric theorems about numbers, people would have thought at the time, well, this is never going to be useful. And then it turns out now it's the foundation of internet cryptography and secure systems. So, you know, quantum theory was incredibly esoteric in the 1920s, 1930s. And yet we're now thinking about quantum computing and having a step change in the amount of compute power we have, right? You don't know which bits of science are going to lead to future innovations. And so that's why I'm saying you can't pick and choose.
Zulfikar, if we just bring you back in then, just to respond to what certainly Donald Trump was saying there, and then also what Professor Pargel was saying. Professor Pargel, I'm going to call you Christina from now on so that we've got you both on first-name terms, if that's OK. But, Zulfikar, it'd be good just to get your response to that.
Well, I agree that it's difficult to pick and choose. I do think that science and innovation research has moved more into that direction, far removed from an essay that was once written about the usefulness of useless information, you know, just doing random research and then working out the connections later on you know, as more and more people come to it. It is true, I would say, that, you know, Donald Trump has an interest in space. But it feels reminiscent of the 60s and the Apollo missions. And with a slightly smaller journalist hat on, I worry personally about the closeness of somebody like Elon Musk in the White House because of conflicts of interest. And I'm not the only person saying this, but it's already being seen that many contracts will go towards Elon Musk's company's interests, maybe not his personal interests, but certainly his company's interests. And what we often don't hear about are the companies that are private still. They're not the public companies like SpaceX and Tesla. But, you know, the idea of getting to Mars is probably an ideological one as well. And so you see that if the research moves more and more in the direction of space research and the technology that goes towards that, and you install a chief financial officer who is an associate of Donald Trump, then it feels rather like it's all being stacked a little bit, and then less money can go, because there is a limited budget everywhere. So less money can go to cancer research. I mean, just one small example out of the pre-pandemic years, many pharmaceutical companies withdrew from cognitive science research into Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia because they couldn't see the returns. I mean, we are talking about businesses here, and we have a business person in the White House, and one of their closest advisors is also a business person, an industrialist.
This
Of course,
seems to be,
you know, horrible cliche. It remains to be seen, but it is what it feels like.
This seems to be a major theme in our chat right now on our YouTube stream, which is that there is a limited budget. And the major thrust of Donald Trump's presidency so far has been to reduce the size of the government, to reduce funding, and he's cutting programs and departments across the entire federal government, and science and research and development is one of those. Universities is one of those. And people have picked up on this. Nilay Chaturvedi says this unfortunately will play out in most large economies simply by lack of money. Increasing defense, welfare, and climate spending will put a strain on funding for academia. We had a post previously, I've misplaced it now, but somebody said that science is not an island. When the economy gets rough, then people start saving there and spending on other things that they think are more important. So my question again, I know we've addressed this, but just maybe to phrase it in a different way to pick up on this theme that's happening in our chat right now is can you give me examples of how this is a direct assault on science rather than just science getting caught up in this slash and burn style of federal savings, where it's easy to point out that experimenting on mice that nobody knows what the experiment is supposed to do is a great way to show, hey, look, we saved you guys $8 million. We're doing a great job. And then maybe in the future, once that showmanship is over, then Trump is going to start supporting the sciences again due to pressure from his colleagues who appreciate what scientists are doing.
Well, there are a few things there. Firstly, it's not a zero-sum game. Countries have invested in science because it makes money, right? Universities and science research are drivers of economic growth, and there have been, studies showing that for every $1 NIH invested, the American economy benefited by $2.50. So it makes money, it makes innovation. Also, health research is incredibly important for keeping your population healthy and productive, right? A sick population isn't as productive. And again, that doesn't generate growth. So there are all kinds of economic reasons why you want to invest in health and education. The other big thing I would say about an attack on science specifically is this attack on diversity in science, right? The first thing is that scientific ability is not limited to high status white men. And that is traditionally who did science, right? Science benefits from getting as many people as possible who have the ability to do science. And the current attacks on DEI and science and grant funding is directly reducing the number of people that we can train and hire as scientists. So that, and we've also seen that actually diverse scientific teams generate better science. They're just better at it. The more perspectives you have, the better science gets it. It thrives on ideas and different life experiences and different questions and different ways of tackling problems. That's the biggest joy of my work as a researcher, is meeting people who have a completely different view of things and learning from them. And together we make something great. By attacking that, he's damaging science.
Christina, thank you very much. And let me just, a couple of things. One, you said DEI. I'm sure everybody knows, but just in case, it stands for diversity, equity and inclusion, and has certainly been something that the Trump administration is very against. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But first of all, I do feel I just need to give you a proper introduction, Christina. I introduced you as operational research, Professor of Operational Research at UCL, that's University College London. But what does that actually mean, that title, just so that people can understand what you are doing?
Yeah, so operational research is an umbrella term. It's a very applied form of mathematics, and it's about problem solving, real life problems with real life decision makers. And you use any tool that's at your disposal to solve it. So it could be data analysis, it could be AI, it could be modeling, it could be kind of management science or management consultancy in some forms. It can be called systems engineering or operations research or something. So that's what I do, and I do it applied to healthcare, both in the UK and internationally. I will say that I trained originally, my PhD was in space physics, and I did my first research job was 3 years in America working as a space physicist before I moved over to this field. So I kind of have experience of both kind of the hard scientists and then the very applied sciences in healthcare.
And one of the things that you have been doing is actually plotting or sort of, writing down and plotting in these charts exactly everything that the Trump administration has done, which has been targeting various parts of U.S. life and the federal government, but also in particular science. You've written various articles. I know you just have published an article actually today in the Guardian newspaper that came out, I think, just an hour ago. And I know that Jared has already put that in the chat for people to read a little bit later. But in terms of what you have been seeing, we can bring up that chart, hopefully. Can you bring up the Venn diagram?
Yeah.
So we've got that, and here it is. And I know it's difficult for people to see that, but again, that will be
Let me zoom in at the headlines here so we can
But just tell us, Christina, just so we can get an idea of what exactly you have been seeing. And obviously, as a data scientist yourself, you have been marking down as what's important. Can you just kind of sum it up for us so we can understand what we are seeing here?
So essentially, what I did is I went and I looked in the academic literature for what are the hallmarks of how authoritarian or regimes that are on the way to authoritarian do about science. And science is one of the areas in which authoritarian regimes are very clear that they want to control it. And they have three main ways of attacking it, which is one of them is control of science to align with state ideology. So it's both putting funding into things that align with it. So in this case, for Trump, it could be space missions and things that to do with extraction of oil and gas, for instance. And it's suppression of non-aligned research. So in the Trump example, it would be suppression of anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where they've already cancelled grants. And also with Robert Kennedy Jr., it's things like he's moving funding away from infectious diseases, away from vaccines, quite deliberately, because that aligns with his beliefs. And then there's a second strand, which tends to be around attacking universities and suppressing dissent. And if you look just in the last 150 years in authoritarian regimes around the world, it's the universities that are often the start of protests. And like some researchers have called them kind of hotbeds of democracy. And you've seen it in the communist Eastern Bloc in Europe in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. You've seen it in China. You've seen it in Iran. You're seeing it right now in Serbia, where they got absolutely mass demonstrations, which has started from the universities. And so attacking universities and trying to undermine their independence is a really key part of what authoritarian regimes want to do. And I think that the attacks that the Trump administration has made on individual universities and universities more broadly is exactly part of that playbook.
Somebody in our chat brought up the idea that what Trump seems to be doing, though, is pushing toward privatization of research, and that does account for the bulk of funding for research and development, not only in the U.S. but around the world. So, how much power does Trump have to actually suppress science that he doesn't like or science that he thinks is not useful, if most of it's going to be funded by private companies anyway? And maybe Zulfikar can also answer this, how it is in Europe with funding. The governments don't really fund most of the science, do they?
No, well, there's a mix, isn't there?
I mean, sorry, go.
Christina, you go. No. I'd rather hear from you, actually.
Well, I was going to say, in the UK, for instance, the kind of research I do, which is in delivery of health services, is almost entirely publicly funded. It's not a profit-making enterprise. Yes, industry does fund a lot of science. It tends not to be as publicly shared, and so you're stifling innovation if you rely only on private science. And also, as someone was saying, if you're thinking about diseases that don't have a lot of profit in them, particularly in overlooked populations or global populations, then that comes from public funding. If you want to track the impact of different policies on your population, whether that's the spread of sexually transmitted diseases or rates of vaccine coverage or chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease, then that's kind of public funding for the benefit of society that I wouldn't expect a private organisation to fund. And it's part of generating that evidence and that data as part of how you hold governments to account by looking for the harms and the benefits of the policies that they're enacting.
And Zulfikar, do you know if it's the same in the EU or in Germany in particular?
Do you know, I'm going to be very honest here, and I think that is very, I'm not an expert on that. I couldn't tell you right now, but it is, you know, if I think about German universities where, you know, education is still free, you know, it is a public sort of good education and academia. But, you know, we saw it during the pandemic as well. There is always a mix between academia and the private sector. And this is, you know, it's just impossible to do it without. I mean, often it's been said that the universities are great for finding out, you know, doing the foundational science, and then you need companies to take it to market, as it were, you know. And that happens in the EU as well. It really does. I would, if I could, just pick up on one of the points that Christina made, that about this idea of authoritarian administrations, governments. I was talking to an academic at Edinburgh University last week, Theo Bourgeron, the political scientist, who has also written about this idea that you've got authoritarian, libertarian governments who take a certain stance, and he tracked this during the pandemic as well. And the idea of, you know, I'm thinking, sorry, I should backtrack a little bit. I'm thinking about the bird flu outbreak in the US, where RFK Jr. has said, oh, we should just let the virus spread and, you know, let those that die, and then breed the super chickens, which has very crazy overtones that I don't really want to speak about
for a second
now. Well, you picked up on the point marvelously there. But let's not go down that little rabbit hole. So that's what he's saying. You know, we can see which chickens are immune, and, you know. Now, I lost my train of thought. That's right. Okay, let the farmers decide for themselves. Let every individual deal with the problems themselves. We don't want government to be paying for these things. It's a small step from chickens to humans, particularly with bird flu, because humans do also get infected. And so it is really problematic. Theo Bourgeron, this academic I spoke to, was talking about that, you know, governments such as the one that we're seeing right now in the States will be looking very closely at what money they spend and where they spend it, because, and particularly in the case of the US administration now, where so many people have business interests in parallel to their government interests, that they're finding it harder and harder, Bourgeron said, to maintain the levels of profit that they've been enjoying over the last couple of years. He referred to an accumulation crisis that is coming up now. And so so one of the situations, you could turn it around and say, this is why I'm trying to be a little bit fair. Maybe it's not all just an attack on science, but it is just, it is also an attempt to maintain certain levels of profit, certain controls over markets, etc., to make sure that you have a certain sector of society that can continue to make that money. And how do you do that? One way is chaos. And I think that's partly what we're seeing here. A lot of executive orders, a constant stream of executive orders, a constant stream of sacking people and then reinstating people, thinking that it's, wonderfully gung-ho and okay to say, as Elon Musk did, say, I'm going to make mistakes. You know, get used to it. Mm-hmm. This is not what people, if I think of John Stuart Mill, people really expect from their government, which is to protect the people. And so, I've lost my train of thought, but essentially I wanted to agree with you, Christina.
So, and Christina, you've made it very clear that you think that the Trump administration is following the authoritarian playbook. You've got for example, we've just shown your Venn diagram, and you've also got a Google Doc that you have made public where you have been listing all types of things that have been done by the administration, which also play into this. I just wanted to ask you, I guess, in particular, because...
Let me just cut in there for 1 second. We can share both the Google Doc here. This is the Google Doc, with both the Google Doc, and we have also already shared the Venn diagram. If you guys want to look at this stuff while Christina explains it, and really, feel free to find them in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, and you've talked, Christina, about other countries that you talked about Serbia, you talked about other authoritarian regimes. Do you believe now that the Trump administration is an authoritarian regime? Will you go that far, or is it just that they are following some of those precepts that have already been set out by other authoritarian countries?
I think they're trying to be. I don't think I can say that they are until we see what happens at the next election. I mean, quite apart from the attacks on science, the things that have been happening in terms of undermining the rule of law, attacking the judiciary, attacking law firms, I find extremely chilling. And they're now trying to further restrict the rights of people to vote. I can't see any other explanation for it. I mean, it does map pretty much exactly on what other authoritarian regimes have done. And people who've studied it, like Timothy Schneider, who's been writing a lot in, I think, in New York Times. And then there's an academic from, I can't remember where, but who wrote a book about how democracies die. I think he said the same thing, that if anything, the Trump administration is going a lot quicker than recent authoritarian regimes. And it doesn't have to be a totalitarian regime where there are no elections. You can have what they kind of term a liberal democracy, a bit like what Orban's doing, where you have elections, but the playing field is so skewed that there's only ever going to be one outcome. And that, I think, is where you're going when you control the information space. I mean, any dictator in the world would kill for something like Twitter, with Elon Musk pumping out information that aligns with the regime to 200 million followers. You know, they've done executive orders aimed at specific law firms that make it impossible for them to carry out lawsuits against the administration. And those firms have now caved to the demands. But basically, there's no point having protections in law under the Constitution if you can't find a law firm to represent you.
Okay.
It's incredibly scary when you have people, giving out the public names of family members of judges. I mean, this to me is authoritarian actions.
And one of the things that we have seen are certain people being denied access to the United States, even deported, including from the scientific community, Christina. Would you yourself consider going to the United States at the moment?
No. And I used to go every year. I've lived in the States for 4 years. I have many friends there. I was there last summer at Yosemite. It has, like, the national parks are a wonder of the world to me. But no, I wouldn't go. They're not following due process. I mean, I couldn't take that risk. I mean, maybe it's a tiny risk, but it seems that once you end up in detention, you lose any kind of power or control over your situation, and I find that deeply frightening. I think in terms of science more broadly, it's the first time in my life that I'm advising my early career researchers not to apply for positions in the US, because you don't know if your funding is going to stay, and you don't know if your visa is going to be rescinded. And so I can't, in all conscience, advise them to work out there, even though for me it was an amazing opportunity 20 years ago, and I loved every minute of it.
And let me just pick up on that, because it would be great if anyone in the chat has got a view on this. Like, would you still go to the United States? Would you be worried about studying there, or does it not bother you? Would you be worried about, for example, going to a conference? Put your points in the chat. Hopefully Jared or Amian can read some of them out a little bit later, but it would just be good to get a sort of an idea of how everybody is feeling about those kind of issues. But what you're talking about, Christina, then, is a sort of a climate of fear. I know we talk generally about the United States, about what's going on, but also particularly within the scientific community and the academic community.
I mean, as I said, I have a lot of contacts in science, particularly in the health community in the US. And yeah, they're seeing their grants cancelled overnight. And what that means is that the researchers that they're employing lose their jobs. Many universities are stopping taking in new PhD students, new postgraduate students, because they don't know what's going to happen to the funding. They don't know what's going to happen to their federal funding and whether they can afford that. The next generation of scientists are not being trained. It takes decades to build a scientific career. Why would you go into it if you don't know if there isn't a job for you in 10 years or 15 years? And that is going to be a damage that lasts years, far beyond a 4-year presidential term.
Yeah. We had a comment.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Because I was just, again, thinking about what you're saying, Christine. I mean, I really should be careful with my opinions here, but I think, you know, the long-term view is what also really worries me, because that chilling effect of saying, you know, the academic environment, the academic community is uncertain, is enough to stop people going into academia. And in terms of authoritarian regimes, we see it all the time. And even actually with what's happening in Germany right now with the AfD and what's happened over the last decades is it starts very early on. And so if you have school leavers who are already looking at what their prospects are for the future and they're saying, I'm not going into academia, well, you are already training the next generation to think a certain way. And that's where it is an ideological attack, and it does become an ideological attack, if not directly on science, as we traditionally term it, like, you know, like medicines or what have you, but maybe just thinking and, you know, just thinking for yourself. That's already a science in itself. That is really kind of worrying. And I can also say from our perspective that, you know, when we've been trying to contact people in the States, my colleagues, Fred Schwaller, Matt Aegis, they said, yeah, plenty of scientists will talk off the record. And you say, well, can I record it now? And they say no. And this is even scientists who were in, for instance, one example in the UK about to travel to the US. They will not talk now because they just don't know. And that is really scary. And you know, what do you do? It's your livelihood. It's not just science. It's people's lives, you know.
I think it's pretty much,
yeah, sorry.
It's not really disputed on either side that what the MAGA movement represents, what Trump represents, at least for universities, is the end of the idea that the government should have any role, taxpayers should have any role in funding young people to just sit around and think and come up with new ideas. In our comments, we've heard people who are supporting what Trump's doing saying that it's not the time for that now. And I think the best, most nice reading of that would be, look, we have a lot of problems in our society, and debating philosophical questions is not going to get us anywhere in that. My question now goes back to one of the first comments that was in our chat, which is that the brain drain is from the EU. There's a lot of talk on the right wing in the US that the EU is collapsing. Everybody wants to come to the US where there's still wealth. But at least for scientists who are doing things that the Trump administration doesn't agree with, or scientists in general, if we're talking about a general climate here, do you believe, I'm opening this question to both of you, do you believe that you'll have academics actually going to Europe, or is this the age-old threat of Americans, I'm going to go to Canada if my non-preferred candidate wins the election, and then that never happens because people stay in the wealthiest country in the world?
But before we just answer that, actually, as we've now jumped on to about the EU, why don't we just listen to the French education minister who's talking specifically about this, Elizabeth Bourne. She is talking about trying, for example, to attract these scientists who may be feeling under threat to Europe. We know that European countries have already said that they will be willing to take some of these American scientists. So, for example, France, the UK, Cambridge University, also in Germany as well. Let's just listen to the French education minister, and then it would be good to open this up as a discussion.
Since Donald Trump's re-election, there's been an unprecedented challenge to all scientific consensus, destruction of databases, and researchers and laboratories can no longer continue their work in the United States. In this context, it's important to assert that France and Europe believe in free research, academic independence, and that naturally we want to do everything to preserve this scientific capital, especially by welcoming researchers.
So just to put that into context, that's where this question is coming from. Christina, it'd be great to hear from you first.
I mean, I have to say that one of the things that I hear most among my colleagues is just disbelief that America would do this to one of its most successful industries. Like it is a leader in world science. And certainly the universities and people I know in the UK and in the EU are seeing it as a massive opportunity to see whether they can lure over some of the greatest minds. Now, there are some barriers to that, not least is that US academics get paid considerably more than European ones. But, you know, we do offer now more scientific independence. So yeah, I think you will see some people leave. Not as many as people think. I think it's a big ask for people to leave their lives, their kids' lives, their spouses' lives. I mean, I think actually people. Well, let me put it this way. I was talking to a scientist in the UK a few weeks ago who grew up and trained under in communist Soviet Union. And she said, you accommodate very quickly to new rules and restrictions. And if you're going to fight against new constraints, it has to happen early, because then you just kind of make peace with it and you put your head down and you try and just carry on as much as you can. And I think that is what most people will do. But nonetheless, I still think there is a big opportunity for Europe to try and get some of the best US scientists over here.
Well, and we're not just talking about Americans leaving the US, but the Europeans who haven't yet gone to the U.S. for postgraduate studies or for their scientific research. It's something like half of all American U.S. Nobel Prize winners are not born in the U.S. So it's a huge part of the scientific community in the U.S. aren't what Trump would consider Americans anyway.
Yeah.
And Zulfikar, maybe you could also
Christina,
say
could
your
I
predictions for the future. Are we going to be flooded by Americans trying to win the next Nobel Prize
actually,
for
I wanted to ask.
Germans?
The Americans have already won the next Nobel Prizes. Okay, let's move on. But Christina, I actually wanted to ask you whether you think that the UK, Europe can actually carry scientists from the States. I mean, we hear about this, but you know, France saying, well, I forget where it was exactly, but saying we've set aside X million for 15 positions over 3 years. I read today, I think it was. I mean, given that research is so networked, it's not just an isolated case, is it? I mean, how do you feel about it? Is it that it's not just something that's happening in the US and people are fleeing, and then you can just join our research here, because it's all networked globally, isn't it?
There is no way that Europe can take over the massive amounts of funding, say, that NIH used to have or that NASA has. But you can certainly create new positions and see it as an investment to create new permanent academic positions for people to come here. I think you can do quite simple, straightforward structural changes. So, for instance, you can make it a lot easier to go through the visa process if you're coming from outside Europe or outside the UK, to make it more attractive for people to apply for positions that are advertised. So when we advertise research positions, they're advertised globally, and we, you know, most of my team weren't born in the UK. Like, that is part of science, right? It's about getting the best minds from wherever they're from. So making those processes easier is one way you can attract US scientists over here as well.
We actually have a graph showing statistics from 2021 about spending on, this is spending on research and development. This is the United States. You can see it's been increasing pretty rapidly since 2016. That's the percentage of the GDP. If you scroll down, Dustin, that shows you which countries spend the most of their GDP. The United States is third after Israel and Korea, but it's such a huge economy that actually it dwarfs everybody else in terms of spending. I think it was in 2021, it was over 700 billion US dollars, which is more than twice, way more than twice the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you guys want
to can I just say one?
Sorry, Dustin was just saying that if people want to find their own country, they'll put this in the chat as well, and they can see where their country is on that list. Sorry, Christina, continue, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is one area where I think there is a massive opportunity, and that's in climate change science and climate technologies. I definitely feel that is one of the biggest growth areas of the future. Well, now onwards, really, countries are going to be investing in climate tech, and the people who get there first those countries are going to see massive profits from that. And it's no accident that China's been investing heavily in it for much longer, sadly, than some other countries. And given that America is explicitly getting out of the climate change business, I think there's a massive opportunity for Europe to drive that forward.
Yeah, and it will be very interesting to watch China as well, won't it, and to see what happens next with that. Thank you very much for that. I do just want to very quickly, Christina, go back to when we were talking about DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion. And I had mentioned before that you have written an article that's just been published today in one of the British newspapers, The Guardian. But this whole issue of woke and a concern. So we know that the Trump administration, obviously they're trying to cut costs, but also they have made it very plain that they want to cut out funding for scientific research on issues or themes that they don't agree with. And it appears that there are many US voters and also in our chat, people who agree with that there is too much woke science and woke research. What would you say to those people who believe that?
I mean, I don't even know what woke research is. I mean, the list of how science has been skewed by not having a diverse workforce and diverse research priorities is huge. Like, for instance, for decades, there wasn't really very much research into sickle cell disease, which primarily affects people of African origin. And it was only in 2019 that they had the first treatment for it. And that's from decades of advocacy from Black groups actually in the US. We know that women have been underrepresented in the medical sciences, and research has really lagged into serious health problems to do with reproductive care and menopausal care that affect our economy, because women are then unable to work because of pain, say endometriosis, which affects 1 in 10 women and causes huge amounts of pain and infertility. And if you don't have those people, it's not even have to be a conscious bias. It's not that people are there, I'm not going to look at women. It's that it doesn't occur to them because it's not part of their experience. And that's why you need people who have different types of experiences, different types of priorities, so that we create science and health for everybody. And I don't see that as being controversial.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Can
Christina.
I say also that...
yes, please.
Sorry, I mean, it's again, in agreement. It's not only the science, though. It's frontline medicine, though, you know. So these issues that you're talking about, Christina, also like during pregnancy, you know, certain groups of people, women are not sort of, it's, to put it in plain terms, not taken seriously when they make certain complaints during pregnancy. And then these people get into seriously dangerous situations, or they die. And that's still happening. We think that, you know, these days, who dies in pregnancy? Lots of people. And so it's not just academia. It's not just... And this, I think, sort of like, you know, what is also problematic with this sort of attack on science is because we believe, the short form of that is these ivory towers, right? You know, where only certain people, privileged people, can sit and spend their days reading stuff and what have you. But it trickles down to the hospital, where everybody goes to. You know, where everybody should be able to go to if you're lucky enough to be close to a hospital. And so, you know, and also this issue of sort of inclusion, thinking about measles again, it really made me sad to be reminded of the very first measles vaccine was tested in the United States and in Nigeria. And today, we still have situations where most tests are not done regionally. You don't have specific tests that test the vaccines or drugs on the people who are actually going to need them most. This is why you have startups in India saying, well, we're going to run 2 parallel studies. We're going to do studies for India and maybe even a particular region in India. And then we'll do another one, which is international, so that we can get our our product, let's say, approved by the FDA, which is still the leading body, but that is lacking. And so if you sort of create this sort of air whereby you can't even include certain words in research papers or in anything that you might write about, again, referring to one of my colleagues, the idea of striking mRNA from acceptable vocabulary will not just affect mRNA vaccines. It's like you can hardly do any biological research without mentioning mRNA somewhere. It's going to come up. So it's just really, really problematic, but anyway.
I do think that just,
what can you do?
I think I'm the only American in this conversation right now, except probably in the chat. But just from my own perspective, looking at the conversations that were had during the pandemic, also the conversations that around RFK Jr. And his ideology about how health is supposed to work. The idea is that if you continue to do research to solve every single problem, then people themselves are going to get weaker. That was like during the pandemic. The idea was if you come with a vaccine, then you're going to take away the responsibility of the person to just be fit and eat healthy and have a strong immune system. So I know this is beyond the realm of science here, and in some ways that is anti-science in itself, this idea that people are responsible for their own health. But I do think that's a driving factor here, and I don't think that the argument that, well, this trickles down to the hospital bed where rare diseases are going to be cured, that this is very convincing to a lot of people who are happy to do away with what they see as esoteric science.
It's kind of to say there's no such thing as being healthy enough to overcome serious infectious diseases. And the fact that people say that is because vaccines have been so bloody successful in stopping these childhood diseases. Things like diphtheria, tetanus, meningitis, they killed 10% of people. Polio left 1% of people paralyzed. It wasn't nothing to do with how fit you are. In the Roman era, 50% of children died under the age of 5. I mean, we have got fitter and healthier through science. And I think the fact that we've been so successful at it, now people forget just how dangerous it was to be a child 50, 60, 80 years ago.
There have been some failings of, and I'm not blaming the scientists, but at least established truths in health and public health in the United States, specifically regarding pesticides, certain carcinogens that were promoted by industries, which were based on research done by scientists that they had hired. I'm thinking about tobacco, I'm thinking about DDT, thinking about, I know that genetically modified organisms are not that controversial among scientists, but people still feel like this is a danger to them and they'd rather not eat them. And for a long time in the US, it was controversial just to even label them. I think Republicans were on that side where they're like, no, it doesn't matter, just eat it and shut up. And the Democrats were saying the same thing. And I think a lot of the skepticism when I was young was actually coming from the fringe left who were saying, hey, we want natural foods. We don't want these products that are made by scientists in a laboratory. And so I think this has been confused in the past several years, where you're saying that science brought us health. It brought us the ability to live to the age of 80 on average, to expect all of our children to survive infancy. But at the same time, there have been things that happened in science since World War II that felt a little bit about like experimenting on the population.
Yeah, no, there have been, particularly in industries and environmental and food industries, you're right. But I would say that as soon as it is in the public domain that there is harm, governments have tended to regulate and remove those harms from the food chain or from the environment. Certainly that's what happens in the UK and the Europe. I mean, that is kind of what your regulations are for the FDA and the EPA, which is what the Trump administration is now trying to slash. I mean, they're there to protect you from those kind of industrial harms that we've seen over the last 50 years, but they're now removing those. So I don't think it's a particularly consistent position, is what I'll say.
Thank you very much.
I think also,
I am actually just going to jump in here because we are slightly running out of time. Sorry, so I am going to just jump in because I would like to ask you both one final question before we let you go, because I know you've stayed over your allotted time. I'm very grateful to both of you for that. What do you think, specifically talking about the US, so back to the US, and just to remind everyone, our question has been, or our topic, how the Trump administration is targeting scientific learning in the United States. Christina, what do you think this means for the future of scientific learning in the US now? What do you think we are going to see? How is this going to play out in the next few years?
I think you'll see a gradual decline. I don't think it's something that you're not going to suddenly notice this massive decline in 1 year or 2 years' time. But the innovations, the technologies, the new medicines that you would have had in 10, 15 years are now not going to come, or they're going to come later, or they're going to come from different countries. And you'll just see less influence, fewer people doing it, and less innovation. And can I just say one thing, just in defense of universities, we don't sit around all day pontificating about abstract philosophy, or at least that's not my experience of it. It's about teaching people how to think and how to use the tools of whatever subject they are studying to come up with solutions for society's problems, to help people live the lives that they want to live. That's how I see university education.
Thank you very much, Christina. We really appreciate the time that you have given us, because I know you're extremely busy. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. So I'd just like to say goodbye to Professor Christina Pargell, who is from University College London, UCL. And, of course, as we said before, you can find lots of the links to her Substack pieces that she's written, and also the Guardian article in our chat. So do take a look at that. But Christina, thank you very much from all of us. We look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you for having me.
And Zulfikar, just before we let you go, it would be good just to get a final take from you on that same question. What do you think this means for the future of scientific learning in the US?
I have to be honest, obviously always honest, but reluctant to make a prediction, only to say that, see, I can only speak from my gut here, really. I worry that we're just going to see this idea of science as one thing becoming more and more concrete. And so, you know, this is one thing that Christina was sort of alluding to there, and that has spoken about, but and what you also mentioned, I mean, you know, yes, scientists have done bad stuff. I mean, crikey, we created the atomic bomb, you know, and all sorts of biological problems. But this is, you know, to push this line always, I think, you know, and certain governments do it, is a misconception of what science is. Science keeps building on things. So we learn more and more. And this is why you need to keep funding universities, why you need to keep encouraging people to go into academia, to go into science, because you build on stuff. You say, hey, yeah, we had this idea and it went a bit askew. How can we fix it? How can we make it better next time? And this is, I think, what's possibly not going to happen. So you will not see people fixing certain issues in science, in the scientific community, because it just won't be worth their while, because the scientific funding will be skewed in a certain way, will be driven towards more technology, rockets, and perhaps a more engineering sort of style of science, you know, where people can see things. And the problem with a lot of science in the past is, like, you know, it's a bit like the bomb that you don't see going off or you don't feel. Nobody congratulates you for stopping a terrorist attack. They only blame you when it goes off and people die. And this is that's why it's so difficult to quantify. It's so difficult it's not tangible at all most of the time to say, well, you're still alive, aren't you? Well, was I going to die? I don't know. So it's very, very difficult. For me, as a journalist, working in the science field, I could just feel it's like, you know, it's going to get harder and harder to convince people that it's worth looking at this. Have a read of it. Try to make up your own mind rather than just sucking up what certain people tell you is the truth. Because usually there are a few truths.
Yeah, my favorite example
I've gone off on a weird tangent again.
My favorite example, though, is how the experiments on lizard saliva and lizard poison might have been canceled if you weren't expecting them to invent Ozempic, which is one of the most popular drugs at the moment. So, yeah, on that note, I second that you can't see all of the
go lizards.
Successes
go
that come
lizards,
out of science.
Zulfikar Arbani, thank you so much for being with us throughout this entire stream. We really appreciate it, and really good to get your thoughts on all of that.
Thanks for being honest.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to come to you, Jared, actually for two things, because number one, I did say, did anybody have any comments, you know, about going to the US?
Yeah,
or
I mean,
in the chat. I don't know whether anybody...
I just want to, maybe before we get to that, there's been quite sort of some debate in the chat on what is woke science and what that really means, as you might expect. Also lots of debate too on the influence of the private sector and private money on innovation and research today. So that's been really interesting to notice. At the very beginning of the chat, the professor said that she thought Donald Trump had a fundamental misunderstanding of science, and I put that in the question in the chat to see what people would have to say and if they agreed or disagreed. And someone wrote to me, Trump doesn't understand how science works, but this is something that most people don't understand. So his misunderstanding, according to one of our users. Someone else wrote, Trump is not anti-science, but for science when it can make money and when it can be industrialised and used to propel the economy. And this is interesting because the professor sort of made the point that science is a driver to the economy. So for every dollar you invest in science, I think she said you got $2.50 back, or whatever the number was. So it is a driver for innovation, and there are economic reasons to invest in science. Coming to your question, would you still travel to the US given what we have been talking about today? Someone wrote no with about 5 or 6 zeros, O's after that, so no. Someone else wrote, of course not. Jonathan wrote, I'm in the US and I want to leave. He said, the administration is a threat to my spouse who is studying plant science, and also to Jonathan's daughter. So lots of really interesting takes on that now.
OK, thank you very much for that. And while we're talking to you, Jared...
Yeah, the poll, right. OK, so we asked you, is Donald Trump undermining US scientific dominance? Maybe not surprisingly, almost 70% of people voted yes, that research is going to suffer. Just 6% thought that no, Trump is not undermining scientific dominance because there was no alternative really to the US. 13% said no, phony science must be purged, and same number, 13%, said that it was too early to tell yet.
Gosh, so a clear winner there. Research will suffer.
Exactly. Almost 70% there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, great. Do you have any comment about that?
No, I have some nice comments from some of our viewers to wrap up, maybe. DeVos said, the failures in science are just as important as the breakthroughs. And Orange Cat said 99% of research leads to nothing, but it's needed in order to get to the 1%. Scientific method is hard, expensive, but has paid off and saved humanity a few times over.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. I know we've gone on a little bit longer today, but it was a very good conversation. We really appreciate all your questions, your comments, and just being with us, and hope you enjoyed it as well. And we'll be back next week. We'll be back next week. You can pop on our community post about 24 hours before to find out what we're going to be talking about, and we will see you then. Thank you very much.